Hi, I'm Meshal Malik, and you're watching Indus Special. As World Interfaith Harmony Week is observed around the world, on today's show, we take a look at why there seems to be a sustained rise in hostilities against religious groups across the world. And we discuss whether interfaith capacity building can be a solution to conflict and violence. Joining us to explore this today is Mr. Yasser Louati, who's the head of the Justice and Liberties for All Committee, a Paris-based human rights and civil liberties organization. He joins us from Paris. Also joining us is Mr. Byron Matarangas, who's a lawyer and political scientist from Istanbul, and Professor Alison Scott-Baumann, who is a professor of society and belief at SOAS and author of Islamic Education in Britain, a pluralistic view, joining us from London. Thank you all for joining us, and a warm welcome to the show. Mr. Louati, let me start with you. Now, of course, we're discussing and celebrating interfaith harmony across the world, but this conversation needs to begin with the fact that we are seeing a rise in hate crimes. We're seeing a rise in conflict and violence directed towards religious groups. What do you think is fueling this?
Well, there are multiple factors. First, I can speak for France, and which has been the laboratory of religious hatred for quite some time. We see that first, there has been an aggressive campaign by many secular fundamentalists that have been trying to either delegitimize or even criminalize belief in religion, in God, and so forth. So many have seen this to be unacceptable in quote-unquote modern society. So what they fail to understand is that the public space is for everybody, whether you are a religious person or not, a believer or not. The other one, we have seen various governments, especially state apparatus, pitting communities against one another. For example, saying that this minority is the suspect minority, and these are the good guys, and etc., which has been fueling tensions between religious groups. And the other point, unfortunately, when it comes to interfaith dialogue, it does not correspond to grassroots efforts. So, for example, you will see various events, even international events on interfaith dialogue, etc. But at the grassroots level, you do not see communities and grassroots organizations working with one another to tackle common challenges. And this is why many people call
Right, Mr. Louati, hold on to that thought, because those three key points that you bring up are, of course, a great opener for this discussion. I'm going to take this to Mr. Matarangas and talk to him about the 3 points you talked about, which is trying to undermine the belief in God and religion. You're also talking about how there's not grass-level inter-harmony movements being created. And of course, governments pitting different religious groups against each other. Mr. Matarangas, for you, do you see this being the crux of the problem?
Well, to secure the harmonious religious coexistence in a society, within the society of a state, it is not an easy thing, yes, but first of all, tolerance should be taught, tolerance should be accepted, and mutual respect for the beliefs, religious convictions of the other people, of other individuals, which are different from the beliefs and the religious convictions of our society, of our group. Religion is a very sensitive feeling, very, very sensitive feeling in all people, because it relates to the divine power, to the supernature, to God. And the people, particularly those who have religious feelings, who are believers, are very sensitive in this conviction. And they think that their conviction, their belief is the right one, or the best one, and the others are inferior. This should be replaced by the approach that we all have to respect the different convictions, the different religious convictions, the different beliefs of other people.
Right.
And you say this is the reason why religion is still being used as a tool of dividing peoples, as a tool of war, because it is the most efficient tool.
Mr. Matarangas, that's a very strong point. And I'm going to raise this question with all three of you. I want to take this Professor Baumann now and ask her. Now, this is a point that has been raised by Mr. Louati, raised by Mr. Matarangas, that it's being used as a tool to divide, to exploit by the state specifically. Now, the concept of a secular state would be for not to interfere in personal lives, but it seems like religion has become a matter of the state. Why do you think that has happened?
My research is about students on campus. So over 2 million in a country like Britain attend university every year. And I have to say that they feel watched by state mechanisms, and yet they are the voice of the future. So what they also tell us is that although their campus is secular, they really enjoy religious flavors on campus. They like being alongside people of other faiths. So there's a great strength there. If we want to see them as change agents, we should also accept what they ask for, which is more interfaith activities. So students on campus are saying that when they make a friendship with somebody of another faith, they become transformed in their attitude, particularly towards Islam. They want more of this to replace and displace the bad digital vibes that they get when they go online and look up Islam.
Right.
They also
Professor Baumann, and now I will continue with what you're saying here, but going back to that point that you mentioned, that many of these students feel watched by the state. Now, that's an essential point, and especially since you're talking to us outside of the UK, which is, amongst the developed part of the world, we're seeing a rise of this insecurity amongst many religious groups, even in the developed parts of the world. What do you think has caused this to happen?
So obviously there is tremendous fear worldwide about terrorism. It's on the domestic stage. It's a real risk for every government, particularly Western governments feel it because they have been at peace for a long time. So students, whether they are Muslim or not, feel that they are being misunderstood. They would actually like to help to resolve the tensions created by extremism by having conversations, but they feel that they are discouraged from talking about the Middle East, for example, from talking about faiths, from talking about differences across the religions. They feel they're discouraged from doing this by state policies, which probably do not intend to have this effect, but this is an effect which needs to be set to one side so that we can talk more freely and resolve our differences.
Right. Mr. Louati, the point Professor Baumann talked about, that students want to talk more openly about religion. They want to have these discussions, but it seems like it goes against not only state policies, but the policies of many universities, many places which should be fertile ground for conversation. Do you feel like that resonates with you? Do you think that resonates with the findings you had in your research?
Well, there has been a transatlantic trend between the US, the UK, and France, for instance, to tackle the global terror threat by criminalizing Muslim minorities. And of course, campuses are only the magnifying lens of what's going on at the in broader society. So we have seen the PREVENT program in the UK, CVE in the US, Stop Jihadism in France, just to name a few. And what has been done so far is that saying that, well, because global terrorism is threatening us from the outside and because it is related somehow to the religion of Islam, then any person that practices Islam should also be held as a suspect community, forgetting first that by far, I think 98% of the victims of global terrorism are Muslims in Muslim-majority countries, and that even when global terrorism attacks Western countries, it makes no difference between Muslims and non-Muslims. And we see various academics and students complain pertaining to the state, but there is a complete disconnection between the realities of policymakers and the realities of students and society. Policymakers will tell you we need more security and more violations of human rights to protect us against international terrorism, yet terrorism continues, and at the same time civil liberties are violated. In turn, what happens is that you have a suspect community, and it's the same across the Atlantic, whether it's France, the UK, or France, or the countries we have studied, and Muslim minorities, for instance, find themselves stuck between the attacks of global terrorism and the state at home. And this is where we cannot emphasize enough with policymakers to speak to students and speak to academics and make sure that when they design policies, the stakeholders, which means society, is also at the table.
Right. Mr. Max, now, when we're having this conversation about religious groups and how they fit into the state narrative, especially a modern state narrative, it's important to remember the international law architecture that exists that gives protection to many religious minorities all around the world. Take us through that. Which laws exist which are supposed to be in place in order to protect vulnerable people, their thoughts, their beliefs?
Well, yes, international law protects religious minorities. And there should be make a distinction between the minorities and the migrants groups living in Europe, mainly in Europe. The migrants groups living everywhere in the world are not minorities. The term of minority has a special meaning. Minorities are part of a population. They have been living on a certain territory since a very long time. Like in Pakistan, you have Hindus. And in India, there is a very large Muslim population. Well, it is not a minority. It is a very large, 17%, I think, Muslim population living in India. Yes, international law protects Muslim minorities, and international law
Can you take us through the specific conventions which are supposed to give protection to these groups of people?
Protection should be given. Protection should be given, and legal norms provide for protecting minorities, religious minorities, and the different religious convictions. But if in a particular case minorities groups or immigrant groups are really protected or not, this is a matter of fact, and this depends on the particular circumstances of the society or of a country. We know, unfortunately, that in Western world, Muslim groups have been targeted and they have been suspected as terrorist groups. This is a very bad, very unfortunate. But this happens because of reasons we all know. And we know that there are attempts to link certain religion, in our case the Muslim religion, to terrorism. This is a political manipulation. This is a political manipulation, and those are political games.
That's a point that keeps coming in our discussion here, it being a political manipulation. Professor Baumann, you talked about how students, many academics feel like there is systematic stifling of their voices when they try to bring these issues up. Now, a Pew research found that over 15 countries and most European and Western countries favored some form of restrictions on Muslim women. These are issues that are happening now in this day and age when these countries are claiming great levels of individualism. How do governments, how do institutions make sense of this? How do they justify this?
I think the desire of every state is to keep its people safe. However, I've got two take-home messages for you, Meshal. Two very practical suggestions for how to make us safer. One is to improve the digital literacy of the young. As I said before, when they go online, they can find the most poisonous things about every religious faith. They need to improve their digital literacy. The state should facilitate that. Secondly, it's very important to involve Muslims more closely with countering extremism, because we have many devout, good scholars in Britain who could help enormously with this. So instead of the state arguing that we should stop talking about these dangerous matters, we should talk about them more. And this is true also with regard to the difficulties which Jewish populations are experiencing around the world. And it's also true with regard to the difficulties that Christian populations are experiencing around the world. So the three Abrahamic religions, all three of them are under pressure in different ways. But the Muslims are the key because they are the ones who are allowed to speak least.
Right. Mr. Louati, how did that evolve to becoming that there are three faiths here, three major faiths at least, which see systematic discrimination and increasing systematic discrimination, but it seems like the Muslim population are the ones that are suffering the most. What has happened in recent years to lead to that happening?
For many Western countries, despite Muslims representing a sizable amount of the general population and being into the third, fourth, and even fifth generation in some families, Muslims are consistently perceived as the other, with all the byproduct of such otherization, meaning that it's an other, we cannot integrate them, we cannot assimilate them, they are a threat to our identity, our security, our employment, etc. So in times of sometimes we tend to think that because of the economic crisis, then minorities or communities are targeted as the threat and they're treated as such. Problem is that in France, for example, even when the economy was doing very well and there was no unemployment, Muslims were still being targeted. So we see the continuous scapegoating of communities like in any nation state. So of course, in Western countries, Muslims are being targeted the same way we see today, for example, in China with the Uyghur, but also we have Christian minorities being targeted in other countries where they are minorities. Now, the fact of the matter here, when we speak about Western countries that constantly lecture the rest of the world on human rights and civil liberties and individualism, etc., and fundamental rights, we see that even liberties guaranteed by the Constitution and even by the rule of law, etc., are not permitted in the case of Muslims. And like the person before me just said, we speak a lot about countering terrorism, but these counterterrorism measures, which are in targeting Muslims primarily, they never allow for Muslims to be at the table. I just would like to add one extra point is that we see that even here in this show, as we are talking about extremism, Muslims came in almost like, as predictably, but radicalization and extremism targets any group of human beings. For example, we have radicalization in all religious groups, and even in non-religious groups, you have radicalization in political parties, etc. Now, when it comes down to interfaith dialogue and the way these minorities can be less targeted by governments, it's on the population itself to hold governments accountable when policies not only target a specific community, but once we create a precedent and we allow a specific minority to be targeted, it's only a matter of time that we see these laws targeting the broader population. Another example, in France,
Mr. Louati, to that point, you have a question. It seems like a circular argument that the government, the state is creating these stereotypes. It's creating the other through many narrative buildings, through controlling of narratives, through controlling of debates. And then it is the people who should be able to fight the state. I mean, it seems like there's no way out of this conversation. There needs to be some onus on the state and how they should change. Is it too late to put that pressure on the state now, seeing how events have been unfolding all across the world? We're seeing cases of ethnic cleansing in many parts, cases as extreme legislation being passed that discriminates against Muslims. Is it too late to put pressure on states?
Well, actually, what's happening is that civil society has been excluded for decades when policies were being drafted and even adopted. And that's a major problem. So when you have NGOs stepping forward and asking the governments to backtrack on very dangerous pieces of legislation, like, for example, droning and killing people abroad without due process, what we call targeted killings or stripping of citizenship for people of immigrant descent, etc., governments make sure that not only these NGOs are not at the table when they could speak on behalf of the broader population, but also that they are also demonized. The point I was trying to make earlier is that the laws of counterterrorism that have targeted Muslim communities since 2001 are today being applied against the Yellow Vest movements and against for example, various journalists who investigate on corruption or power abuse. And this is, as you said, it's a circular argument because the only way out of this is when there is a general wake-up call that people come to understand that whenever a minority is targeted, it's only a matter of time before the general population falls also prey of that.
Right. Professor Baumann, now, as we talk about this and the state's role in all of it, there is something to be said about nationalism playing a role in the construction of the other, the demonization of a specific group, the demonization of a specific religion. Why do you think that's essential? We've talked about the political gains, the political maneuvering of how that's being done, but why is that being done? Why is the social construction of the other necessary?
Obviously, the social construction of the other should not be necessary. There should be a strong government that feels it can accommodate difference, not as a threat, but as an asset. It's possible that we will see this in my lifetime, but I would also add to this discussion, Meshal, the fact that I also have good relations with certain parts of government. When I talk about the state, I don't want you to think that the state is necessarily evil. The state adopts policies which may be misguided, but there are other aspects of government machinery who support my work and who are absolutely invaluable to building bridges with different communities. So I think the way forward is for citizens to continue to work with government as strenuously as possible in order to inform them, to engage with them, and to build bridges between government and civil society. And this is the only way to break down the nationalism, the bad nationalism, which leads to far-right extremism.
Right. Professor Baumann, now your research is, of course, regarding many students across university campuses. How can the campus act as a way of bridging, creating bridges across different sectors? How can the university act as a way to extend this interfaith harmony?
That's a lovely question. Thank you. So I'm working with government and with a group of students and staff to increase the understanding that the members of parliament and the civil servants have about all these issues. Because the information that is necessary for a government to move, to change direction, has to be constantly supplied. And students are very good advocates. We're working with Westminster and SOAS to be agents for change, to move the story forward, to alter the narrative by creating bridges so we can communicate the fantastic research that university academics do, and also the opinions of the young. Students have very strong opinions about the fact that they are the voice of the future and they must be heard. So it's a win-win situation as long as we can get Parliament and government and civil service to listen. Right. Which that's the challenge.
Right, of course. Mr. Matarangas, last question to you. Now, we're seeing violence and conflict in many parts of the world and being fueled by religious tensions. What interfaith harmony steps can be taken at a broader international level in order to at least begin to address these issues?
Well, it is a difficult question. Indeed, it is a difficult question. You say, I will quote some examples. Have a look at what is happening in Sweden. In Sweden, which is a very liberal state, a social state, a very liberal state, a Sweden which has accepted without restrictions foreigners, well, mainly Muslims. And now Sweden is at the point of explosion. I don't see of a civil war, because it is not about a war between Swedish people, but it is at the point of an explosion, real explosion. And Swedish people are afraid at their own home, in their own country. well, then one should tackle the reasons of this very, very bad situation. The same everywhere in Europe. I live in Istanbul, Turkey, as I told you, and here we have about 8-9 million immigrants, refugees from Syria and Asia. They are Muslims, most of them, yes, and Turkey is a Muslim country. In spite of this common religion, there are social problems. There are social problems, yes. Turkey has accepted them and goes on accepting them.
Right, and Mr. Matarangas, I will talk more about moving towards solutions, but unfortunately we have come to the end of the segment and we have to go for a break. Thank you so much, Mr. Byron Matarangas, for joining us from Istanbul, Mr. Yasser Louati for joining us from Paris, and Professor Alison Scott-Baumann for joining us from London. We're going to go for a short break. When we return, we're going to continue our discussion. Stay with us. Welcome back to the show while we discuss Interfaith Harmony Week and what can be done to extend practices which can lead towards greater inclusion. Joining us for this discussion now is Ms. Hanadi Chehabeddine, who is an award-winning professional speaker and media expert who starts conversations on how to create more inclusion of Muslims in the workplace. She joins us from Minneapolis. Ms. Chehabeddine, now, you have a very specific work and discussion that you do, which is, of course, about greater inclusion in the workplace. But when we move back a little and talk about the political trends which have impacted the workplace, what changes have you witnessed in the past 4-6 years?
Well, I can talk specifically in the U.S. Since the election of President Donald Trump. There has been a spike in anti-Muslim groups that organizations have been keeping track of. The Council on American Islamic Relations published a report that said that there has been a 600% increase in verbal and physical attacks against Muslims. Now, these statistics are general statistics, not specific to the workplace, but we can only imagine how would that project with religion being the second discrimination factor in the workplace. So when we do talk about how is politics affecting our everyday life, it is affecting it to a great extent. So we can see that politics and religion actually intertwine and affect people's everyday life. It has to be addressed.
Right. Now, many people don't understand the minor and implicit ways in which discrimination can often happen at a workplace. And especially when we're talking about religion, this becomes even more complex. Take us through that, how different things can happen in order to make a person feel uncomfortable because of their religious beliefs.
Yeah, and definitely it can range from bias, which is something that may not necessarily be expressed verbally, but it definitely comes into play in our decision-making process. A simple example would be for an employee not having a way up in the ladder. And it can become even more serious with possibly verbal slurs or expressions that can be said at some point that makes a person feel that they do not belong. And studies show that if there isn't inclusion in the workplace, the productivity is affected. Their sense of belonging to the organization is affected. There's a higher turnover. So companies miss out on a lot if they do not leverage the diversity that they have. And we have to make two distinctions here. Diversity is one thing, and inclusion is something totally different. Diversity is having the variety of thoughts, of ethnic backgrounds, of religious backgrounds, but inclusion is actually make people aware that these differences are actually empowering and a source of innovation and diversity of thought. And not all companies are actually tackling that. A lot of companies have diversity, but they do not really know how to leverage it.
And that's a very interesting point, that distinction you draw, because there is a lot of conversation about a term known as token diversity, just showing that you're diverse for the sake of it to earn brownie points. Let's put it that way. Do you think this facade of sorts is falling apart when these communities, these organizations don't actually see diversity paying off? They don't actually see their productivity increasing?
Yeah, they definitely are missing out on a lot, and it is difficult to give like a determining factor whether a company is actually leveraging this diversity or not. But there are a lot of statistics that prove whether the lower, the entry-level employees actually have a pathway to a mid management or higher management access. So we are talking about data here. We have the ways to measure it over time, and the companies that are taking this seriously, and as you said, not just ticking the box, are actually finding these results in terms of business case, because they do actually see that their profit margins are better. So there is definitely a way to measure it and leverage it, but not all companies are doing it.
And that's one of the central questions. Now, I'm going to tie this back to something that you stated earlier, the rise of hate crimes, discrimination against Muslims specifically after Trump was elected. Now, when the most powerful man in the country has divisive politics and those tactics, that discourse, should and how can companies be incentivized to move towards inclusion and greater diversity? Is there a way around it?
Well, definitely, because even if you follow the statistics on where we were in 2016 and where we are now in 2020, you see that actually people are more familiar with Muslims. So that conflict creates interest. Now, it is up to organizations to tap into that interest and do something about it. But from what I'm noticing personally, that people are more interested, organizations are contacting me, they want to know more. And they start with just regular conversation, having a voice for the Muslim community here in the US. But some organizations are moving into a deeper level of understanding. They want something continuous. They want a program that every single employee, every single person in their company have access to. So they really are in it for the long term. Not all organizations are doing that, but those who have tapped into the power of diversity,
Ms. Chehabeddine, now, of course, when we're talking about discrimination, it's important to keep in mind how different segments are impacted differently. Can you take us through how gender also plays a role in this, how different ethnic backgrounds also play a role, some people being more disadvantaged than others?
Definitely. So I think also companies especially tech companies, have been putting in much efforts in bringing in the gender equation, a more balanced workforce, making the workplace a better place for working moms or working dads. So also in ethnic representation, a lot of companies are initiating ERGs or a business resource group or employee resource group where people who feel like they belong to a certain ethnic background or religious background sometimes, and they really organize like a group for them to feel that they contribute in a specific way, or that they have specific accommodations that they want implemented in this organization. And among the most advanced organizations, that these groups actually collaborate with the business aspect of the organization, because these organizations are tapping into these minority groups. So they have access through these small groups. They are better equipped to understand these minorities.
Right. Now, Ms. Chehabeddine, I have a question that's, of course, twofold, and it moves towards trying to actually get to the inclusion part. It being twofold because, on one hand, it's the company that needs to move forward and make people feel more included, but also how can individuals, those belonging to minority groups, empower themselves through the law, through legislation, through other community support in order to get the rights they deserve?
That's an excellent question, and it is actually part of the work that I'm doing, because the workplace is shifting from the top down to the bottom up. Usually organizations start to take these decisions from higher and mid-level management and then implement it on the lower level. But recent trends has been proving that also employees want to be more empowered, and a lot of people have been able to do this breakthrough. But I'll tell you, the biggest challenge that employees face is that inner empowerment, that piece that allows them to actually be the source of change. This has been a recent trend, as some companies are, when there is inclusion in the workplace, it actually empowers people to be more active and more outspoken. But speaking from specifically the Muslim perspective, I know from my work that a lot of Muslims just want to keep their job. They're perfect employees, but they do not speak up when it comes to a better representation, to an actual program that represents them, or a way to accommodate some of their religious practices. So there isn't a specific pathway for that empowerment yet, but I think a lot of organizations are starting to have this conversation, because they've discovered that it's one of the best ways to actually take that diversity further and move into the inclusion piece of that puzzle.
Right. Thank you so much, Ms. Chehabeddine, for joining us from Minneapolis. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.